Hello and welcome to the To Be Like Christ Bible Study Podcast, where we explore and explain one chapter of the Bible at a time. My name is Luke and I am thy host. And today's chapter is Genesis 40. We're finally getting into the 40s. Let's read the text together. I'm going to be reading from the English Standard Version of the Bible. And while I find it in my Bible, if you have a moment, hit the subscribe button on your podcast player so we can study together again sometime. Genesis 40 only has 23 verses. Let's go ahead and read the chapter. Sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. They continued for some time in custody, and one night they both dreamed. The cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. When Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers, who were with him in custody in his master's house, "Why are your faces downcast today?" And they said to him, "We have had dreams, and there is no one to interpret them." And Joseph said to them, "Do not interpretations belong to God? Please, tell them to me." So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph and said to him, "In my dream there was a vine before me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, its blossoms shot forth, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand." Then Joseph said to him, "This is its interpretation. The 3 branches are 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your office, and you shall place Pharaoh's cup in his hand as formerly when you were his cupbearer. Only remember me when it is well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house. For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I have done nothing that they should put me into the pit." When the chief baker saw that the interpretation was favorable, he said to Joseph, "I also had a dream. There were 3 cake baskets on my head, and in the uppermost basket there were all sorts of baked food for Pharaoh. But the birds were eating it out of the basket on my head." And Joseph answered and said, "This is its interpretation. The 3 baskets are 3 days. In 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat the flesh from you." On the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday, he made a feast for all his servants and lifted up the head of the chief cupbearer and the head of the chief baker among his servants. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, and he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted to them. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to our podcast. We are in Genesis chapter 40 today. We are in the middle of the story of Joseph. We've been talking about him for a couple chapters now. Before we get into his story even more, I want to encourage you before we start to go out onto our website and download our free PDF outline for this chapter. There's one for every chapter of the book of Genesis, and they're all free. So if you want to download it and you can have it in front of you as you're listening to the podcast, that's fantastic. If not, though, you can save it for later and come back and review the information anytime you want. So those are free on our website. You can also buy a book on Amazon.com that has all the outlines in it. Before we get into chapter 40, let's go ahead and remind ourselves a little bit about the details of Joseph's story and do our context, as we always do. We want to understand where we're picking up, since we are coming into the middle of a story, especially if you hadn't listened to the previous studies. So the story of Joseph really kicks off when he's 17 years old. He's the favorite son of his father, Jacob, but his brothers hate him. They hate him so much that they actually sell him into slavery in Egypt. So he goes from Canaan, about 500 miles to the southwest, and now he's a slave in Egypt, this foreign land. He gets sold to a man named Potiphar, and he does really well in Potiphar's house. He serves Potiphar very faithfully, and God is blessing him. And Potiphar is really pleased with the work that Joseph is doing. He puts him over his whole house. He manages everything. But then one day, Potiphar's wife starts to look at Joseph in a way that she shouldn't have. She wanted Joseph to sleep with her, and Joseph refused when she asked. Well, she persisted in this, and Joseph continued to refuse, to his credit. He says, "How can I sin against God and do this, especially also betraying my master, who's put all these things into my hand? But certainly, I don't have the right to have this kind of relationship with his wife." So he continues to refuse. Well, one day she's so spiteful that she accuses Joseph of actually trying to seduce her, and she accuses Joseph to Potiphar, her husband. Unfortunately, Potiphar believes his wife, and he throws Joseph into prison. So Joseph's in prison, and that's where we're going to meet him again in chapter 40. We have been told, though, that even the keeper of the prison, even the prison guard, he really trusts Joseph, and he puts Joseph in charge of things in the prison. So God is still with Joseph. Joseph is serving and being as faithful as he possibly can be in these terrible circumstances that he finds himself in. And so we'll talk about how he eventually gets out of prison, and this is kind of the beginning of that story in Genesis chapter 40. So let's go ahead now and get into our first section, which is our Bible timeline. When did these events happen in history? Well, we already mentioned that Joseph was 17 years old when he went to Egypt. That would be approximately 1728 BC, and he's about 28 years old in the events of this chapter. So about 11 years have passed. He's been down in Egypt for quite a period of time. 17 when he gets down there. He's 28 now, and we can figure that out from some dates and some ages that we have in chapter 41 and some of the other chapters. In terms of our characters today, we really just have two. The first one is Joseph, who I think we at this point have sufficiently introduced. And then we have Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker. So these were officers of Pharaoh. Remember, Pharaoh is the title for the king of Egypt. These were officers of Pharaoh, and they had their dreams interpreted by Joseph while they're in prison. And at least one of them we'll read about a little bit in a future chapter. So they are key to the story. And now, of course, we go down to the bottom of our first page of our PDF and we talk about where these events occurred geographically. The story that's recorded in Genesis 40 took place in the country of Egypt. Now, Egypt, we know where that is. Even on modern day maps, Egypt is still there. But we don't know exactly where in Egypt, because it's a country, right? We don't know exactly what city or what specific location Joseph lived in, where this prison was, or where Potiphar's house was. So we move somewhat swiftly today through our first couple sections, and that brings us to our outline, which will probably also be a little bit shorter than usual. We have 23 verses to cover today, and I think they are pretty straightforward and easy to understand. Nothing super complicated here, I don't think. But let's break it down. Let's make sure that we understand what we read, because these details and Joseph's relationship with this cupbearer is going to be relevant in Joseph eventually getting out of prison. That's not going to happen in this chapter, but we'll see it later on. So section number 1 today is verses 1 through 8, Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker. Sometime after Joseph was thrown into prison, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker committed an offense against the king of Egypt, and they were put into prison. We don't know exactly what they did. Maybe he served Pharaoh moldy bread, or he spilled Pharaoh's drink on his lap. It's probably something a little bit more serious than that. But they commit some kind of offense against Pharaoh, and they get put into prison for this. Now, Joseph is set to attend them. So, generally when you get thrown into prison, you don't have attendants who are waiting on you. They might have gotten a little bit of a cushier, nicer prison than maybe the rest of the prisoners, seeing that they came from the royal house. But the keeper of the prison appoints Joseph to attend to them. One night, they both dreamed dreams. And they were very troubled when they woke up in the morning because they didn't know how to interpret them. We know that there were dream interpreters in Pharaoh's house, but they weren't aware that there were any in the prison. Well, turns out there was one. Joseph told them that God was the interpreter of dreams, and he asked them to recount their dreams to him so that he could give them the interpretation. I think this is really interesting, and this alone is really a great marker of how great Joseph's character was. He's in prison. He could have been moping around and saying, well, God's abandoned me here. He sold me into slavery, and now I'm in prison. My life got even worse. I didn't even think it could get worse. So, God's not with me. But no, Joseph is fully aware that God is with him even in this prison, and he has confidence in that, and that impacts the person that he is while he's in there. And so, knowing that God's with him, he says, well, God is the interpreter of dreams. Tell me your dreams, and God will help me to understand. Verse 9 through 15, then, we have the cupbearer's dream and its interpretation. So it's the chief cupbearer who goes first. The chief cupbearer dreamed about a vine with 3 branches. The vine bloomed and clusters of grapes grew on it. The cupbearer was standing nearby Pharaoh in his dream, and he had Pharaoh's cup in his hand. So he filled it with the juice from these grapes, and he gives it to Pharaoh. And that's pretty much the whole dream. Joseph then gave him the interpretation. He said, in 3 days, the cupbearer would be released from prison and reinstated to his role as Pharaoh's cupbearer, the royal cupbearer. Joseph asked the cupbearer that when this happened to him, that he would mention him to Pharaoh and tell Pharaoh, hey, there's this guy in prison. He's a good guy. He hasn't done anything to get himself into trouble. Maybe we could pardon him or let him out somehow. So he asked the cupbearer, when you go back to Pharaoh in 3 days, put in a good word for me. We see here once again dreams being a key part of Joseph's story. Do you remember the dreams that were part of his story before? It's back in, what was that, chapter 37, I think? Joseph wasn't the one interpreting dreams. He was actually the one having dreams. And he dreamed about the stars and about the sheaves bowing down to him. And it represented his family understood it to represent them, that they were bowing down to him as if Joseph was in some way superior to them. So you remember those dreams back in 37. Now dreams come up again, this time Joseph being the interpreter, or rather God being the interpreter and him giving his message through Joseph. So this is the cupbearer's dream. It's overall pretty positive. So now we talk about verses 16 through 19 in section number 3, the baker's dream and its interpretation. When the baker heard the interpretation of the cupbearer's dream and saw that it was pretty positive, he was eager for Joseph to interpret his. He told Joseph he dreamed of 3 cake baskets on his head. In the top basket, there were baked goods which he had prepared for Pharaoh, but he couldn't keep the birds away. Birds came and they started eating the food that was in the basket. This reminds me of my daily life. I am currently in Athens, Greece. I don't know if anyone's ever been to Athens, but the pigeons, if you walked around with bread on your head, the pigeons would have it devoured in like 3 seconds. The pigeons are savage around here. I've heard the same thing about seagulls in England, but anyway, that's beside the point. So the chief baker, he has 3 baskets of cakes on his head, but the birds are coming and they're eating them. Joseph then tells him the interpretation of his dream, and well, it's not nearly as positive. Joseph tells him that the 3 baskets, they also represent 3 days. In 3 days, Pharaoh was going to hang the baker on a tree, and the birds would come and eat his flesh. So the story takes a bit of a dark turn here with the baker not receiving nearly as positive an interpretation as the cupbearer. So now we've come to our final section, verses 20 through 23, the fate of the cupbearer and the baker. Is Joseph just making this stuff up? Is he just pretending he knows what's going to happen, or is this actually going to come to pass? Well, 3 days later, it was Pharaoh's birthday, and so he celebrates this birthday with a feast. And he summoned the cupbearer and the baker from prison. He gave the cupbearer his job back just as Joseph told him he would, and he hanged the baker just as Joseph said he would. Now, this is kind of good news, at least for Joseph and the cupbearer. Joseph now has an inside man in the palace. He's going to mention him to Pharaoh. The cupbearer is going to mention Joseph to Pharaoh, and Joseph is going to get he's going to have some friends in high places that help him get out of prison. Well, not exactly. The chief cupbearer forgot about Joseph. He forgot to mention him to Pharaoh. And so Joseph remains in prison, which is a huge bummer, I'm sure, for Joseph, maybe thinking every day that after the cupbearer went back to Pharaoh's house, that every day, this is going to be my day, waking up every day. And then we'll see a long period of time going by and he's not getting out of prison. So that must have been a huge disappointment. And again, it would have been a huge temptation to think, you know what, God, why have you left me here? Why have you abandoned me? And for him to abandon his trust in the Lord. But again, what we see is that Joseph never does that. I gotta say, I think Joseph is a better man than me, and he's probably a better man than a lot of us who I think would really get discouraged and depressed and very negative in a situation like this. In the book of Genesis, we've seen some people of very high character, but Joseph, I think, is maybe spoken of best out of any of them, maybe besides Abraham. But really, Joseph's character is exemplary even from the time that he's very young, and as far as I know, only good things are said about him in the Bible. So those are the 23 verses of chapter 40. I think it was probably a little bit shorter of a study today. Let's go ahead and finish up with our application. Ingratitude is a terrible sin. An ungrateful heart is not a godly heart. It's almost hard to believe that the cupbearer forgot about Joseph. But have there ever been times in your life when you forgot about those who helped you during your times of trouble? Maybe so. Have you ever been ungrateful to the people who raised you, those who have poured so much of their time into you, those who have loved you at your lowest point. I mean, how many of us forget often to come back to God and to thank Him when He answers a prayer for us? I know I've certainly done that many, many times. That's terrible. That's terrible. And so we see in the chief cupbearer, he has an ungrateful heart. And we look at that like, how can you do that? And then we look at ourselves and we think about it a little bit harder and we're like, I've done stuff like that before. It's really important to ask God to help you to develop a heart of appreciation, because an ungrateful person is never going to be able to understand and to appreciate the Bible, because an ungrateful person will never appreciate God's greatest gift and just how great it is, and that is Jesus. So cultivate gratefulness, yes, of course, in the big things, but also in the small things. The more appreciative we are of the graces that we receive, even the small graces, the more the Bible will mean to us, the more God's love will mean to us, and the more the overall story of the Bible that we're trying to unpack and uncover in this podcast will mean to us, because we'll have a greater capacity for appreciation and a deeper thanksgiving in our heart for God's salvation. So I think I'll go ahead and leave you right there for today, and Lord willing, I'll be back to talk to you again tomorrow, and we'll discuss Genesis 41 and continue the story of Joseph. He's got to get out of prison at some point. How's it going to happen? We'll figure it out soon. Until then, have a fantastic, schmantastic day.